Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Mr. Gareth Thomas.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House will wish to join me in paying tribute to Captain Thomas Clarke of the Army Air Corps, Flight Lieutenant Rakesh Chauhan of Joint Helicopter Command, RAF Oldham, Acting Warrant Officer Class 2 Spencer Faulkner of Army Air Corps, Corporal James Walters of the Army Air Corps, and Lance Corporal Oliver Thomas of the Intelligence Corps, a reservist who also worked as a research assistant to the Honourable Member for Brecon and Radnorshire. These tragic deaths remind us of the continued commitment and sacrifice of our armed forces, and I know that our deepest sympathies are with their families at this very, very difficult time. I'm sure the whole House would also want to join me in paying tribute to Anne Maguire, who was stabbed to death in her Leeds classroom on Monday. It is clear from the tributes paid that she was a much-loved teacher who had worked at the school for over 40 years. She cared so much about her pupils, she had come in on her day off to help prepare them for exams. Our thoughts are with her family, her friends, and the entire school community in Leeds, who've been left devastated by this truly shocking and appalling tragedy. A criminal investigation is underway, and everything that can be done to get to the bottom of what happened at the school will be done. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr. Gareth Thomas.
I very much associate myself with the Prime Minister's tribute to the servicemen who lost their lives in Afghanistan last week, and to Anne Maguire, who lost her life in the classroom situation that he spoke about. Can I ask him about something different? Last week, the Institute for Fiscal Studies revealed that the government's decision to treble tuition fees will cost taxpayers more than the system it replaced. Is this disastrous policy a symbol of the government's long-term economic plan?
It's enabled is another expansion of higher education. That's what we're seeing under this government. And all of the forecasts from the party opposite, that fewer people would apply to university, those forecasts were wrong. That people from low-income backgrounds wouldn't apply to university, those forecasts were wrong. Unlike other countries, we put in place a system for tuition fees that means we can expand our universities and go on winning in the global race.
Mr. Roger Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister and indeed the whole House for paying their tributes to the 5 men who recently died in Afghanistan. In particular, I pay tribute to Lance Corporal Oliver Thomas, who worked for me in Westminster. He was an outstanding young man who was so well liked and held in such high regard by everyone who knew him and worked with him. The loss bears particularly heavily on his parents and family, and indeed his friends who grew up with him in Brecon and Kington. I'm sure the Prime Minister would want to join me in praising all our reservists who, like Oliver, face all the risks that our armed forces experience and sometimes, sadly, pay the ultimate price.
My honourable friend is absolutely right to pay tribute to Lance Corporal Oliver Thomas. It is a reminder of the sacrifices that we have borne in Afghanistan. This looks as if it was a tragic accident, but we'll get to the bottom of what happened. But he's absolutely right to mention how our reservists in all 3 forces serve alongside their regular colleagues and take all of the risks. And in Afghanistan, they've proved again and again that they are people of huge quality, ability and courage. And as we go forward and expand our reserves, I hope that everyone in our country, particularly businesses, the public sector, local councils and others, including the civil service, will do everything they can to make sure that reservists are welcome in their businesses and supported in the vital work they do for our country.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I want to join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to Captain Thomas Clarke of Army Air Corps, Flight Lieutenant Rakesh Chauhan of Joint Helicopter Command, RAF Oldham, Acting Warrant Officer Class 2 Spencer Faulkner of Army Air Corps, Corporal James Walters of Army Air Corps, and Lance Corporal Oliver Thomas of the Intelligence Corps, who were tragically killed. Mr. Speaker, these deaths are a tragic and poignant reminder of the sacrifices made by our armed forces, including reservists, in serving our country with bravery and distinction. All of our thoughts go to the friends of those who knew those we lost, including the honourable member, and we share his loss. and our deepest sympathy go to the families of those killed. I'd also like to join the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, in paying tribute to the teacher, Anne Maguire, who was murdered in her classroom on Monday. This was an appalling tragedy. It is clear from the testimonies of those who have spoken out since she died that she was an inspiration to those she taught, and all our thoughts are with her family, friends, and the teachers and pupils of the school. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, for the first time, we got to know the names of some of the 16 investors, including hedge funds, who were given preferential access and sold 1/3 of Royal Mail shares. Mr. Speaker, how are these lucky few chosen?
What we're talking about is an exercise in privatising the Royal Mail, which has been a success for our country. A business that lost £1 billion under Labour has now paid money back to the taxpayer, is making profits, and the people we should be praising are the 140,000 employees of Royal Mail who are now, under this government, shareholders in the business they work for.
No answer to the question, Mr. Speaker. The Royal Mail share price is currently 50% above the level it was sold at. Only he would want congratulation for losing the taxpayer £1 billion. Each of these chosen few investors were given, on average, 18 times more shares than other bidders, on the basis that, in the National Audit Office's words, they will provide a stable, long-term shareholder base. And in the words of the Business Secretary, not be spivs and speculators. Can the Prime Minister tell us what assurances, in return for their golden ticket, these investors gave us that they would hold the shares for the long term?
First of all, he says that people were given shares, they paid for shares. Second, he raises again this issue that there was some sort of agreement. There was no agreement. But at the end of the day, he should be recognising that a business that lost money, that he tried in government to privatise but failed, is now in the private sector, making money, succeeding for our country, and its employees are now shareholders. Isn't it interesting that with the growth in our economy, the fall in the unemployment, the reduction in the deficit, he's reduced, like old Labour, to complaining about a successful privatisation?
No, Mr. Speaker. I'm raising an issue about a rip-off of the taxpayer, which the British people know when they see it. And the reason this matters, is because
the orchestrated barracking is very predictable and also incredibly tedious, but it won't stop us getting through. It will just take a bit longer. People can calm down, take a tablet if necessary. Ed Miliband.
Matters is because the sale was grossly undervalued. Shares sold for £1.7 billion when they were sold at privatisation, now worth £2.7 billion. And who cashed in, Mr. Speaker? 12 of the 16 so-called long-term investors made a killing worth hundreds of millions of pounds within weeks. Now yesterday, the representative of the bank that sold the shares said there was an understanding, and I quote, with those investors. He said there was an understanding, that's what it says on the record, Mr. Speaker, with those investors about their long-term commitment to Royal Mail. So why were they allowed to make a fast buck?
Isn't it? We're getting lectures on taxpayer value from the people who sold our nation's gold at the bottom of the market. He talks about ripping off the taxpayer when it was he that left an 11% budget deficit after the biggest banking bailout in Britain's history. But I have to say, Mr. Speaker, these are exactly the arguments that Michael Foot made about the privatisation of the National Freight Corporation. They're exactly the same arguments as Neil Kinnock made about British Telecom and British Airways. It pleases the backbenchers, it excites the trade unions, but it's utterly meaningless. Is he recommitting to renationalising the post office? No, of course not. It's just playing to the gallery because he can't talk about the success of our economy.
Mr. Speaker, he should listen to members of his own side. The member for Northampton South, What did he say yesterday? This privatisation had let people down, and the interests of the taxpayer were not taken into account. He called it unethical and immoral, and he's nodding his head, Mr. Speaker. That is what his own side thinks of it. Now he talks about the postal workers. He talked a lot about the postal workers, Mr. Speaker. So this is very interesting. There were no conditions on the hedge funds, but there were conditions on other groups like the postal workers. Can he explain why postal workers were told they couldn't sell their shares for 3 years, but hedge funds were told they could cash in on day one?
The post office workers were given their shares, and it's right that they were given their shares, and let's celebrate the popular capitalism. Let's celebrate. I thought he believed in empowering workers. We've now got 140,000 workers who've got those shares. Now, in terms of the risk to the taxpayer, he ought to reflect on this.
Order, there's far too much noise in the chamber. Miss McTaggart, I say to you, you're an illustrious product of the Cheltenham Ladies' College. I cannot believe that they taught you there to behave like that. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, you're right that there is a lot of history in this shouting, because, of course, in the past, with all these privatisations, we had the shouting of the Kinnocks, the shouting of the Prescotts, the shouting of the Straws. Over Easter, I was looking at Labour's candidates, and son of Kinnock is coming here. Son of Straw wants to get here. Son of Prescott wants to come here. It's the same families with the same message. It is literally the same old Labour. That is what is happening. Now, he asked about taxpayer value. This is what the National Audit Office found. The National Audit Office said privatisation has reduced taxpayer risk to support the Universal Postal Service. This is a good deal for taxpayers because this business was losing $1 billion. It is now making money, paying taxes, gaining in value, good for our country, but bad for Labour.
Mr. Speaker, the Post Office is actually making a profit when they privatised it. And what have we discovered today? It's one rule for the postal workers and another rule for the hedge funds. And, Mr. Speaker, who runs these hedge funds? They've been very coy about who runs these hedge funds. None other than the Chancellor's best man runs one of them. So why is it, Mr. Speaker? It's one rule if you deliver the Chancellor's best man speech, and it's another rule if you deliver the Chancellor's post.
What this shows, Mr. Speaker, he can't talk about the deficit because it's falling. He can't talk about the economy because it's growing. He can't talk about jobs because there are 1.5 million more people in work. So he is painting himself into the red corner by only talking about issues that are actually successes for the government, but appeal to the trade unions, the left-wingers behind him, and the people who want to play the politics of envy. That's what's happening in British politics. Everyone can see it. Nothing to say about the long-term economic plan that shows Britain is on the rise and Labour is on the slide.
And, Mr. Speaker, what we know is there is a cost of living crisis in this country. You see, they don't think there's a cost of living crisis. And why not? Because they stand up for the wrong people. The more we know about this privatisation, the bigger the fiasco it is. A national asset sold at a knockdown price. A sweetheart deal for the city. And the government totally bungled the sale. Everything about this privatisation stinks.
6 questions and not a mention of GDP, not a mention of what happened while we were away in terms of employment figures, not a mention of the fact the deficit is getting better. We know, Mr. Speaker, he's got a new advisor from America. Yes, he has, Mr. Axelrod, and this is what he's being advised to say. Let me share it with the House because I think this is excellent advice. He says this: there's a better future ahead of us, but we must not go backward to the policies that put us in this mess in the first place. I don't know what they're paying him, Mr. Speaker.
Order.
But I haven't finished.
Order. response to that question, the Prime Minister has finished, and he can take it from me that he's finished. Dr. Liam Fox.
Mr. Speaker, from the cyber attack on Estonia to the invasion of Georgia to recent events in the Crimea, we've seen a clear pattern of behaviour from the Kremlin, and the West has allowed itself to allow wishful thinking to take the place of critical analysis. Given that defence exports from the EU to Russia have amounted to about €700 million in the last 3 years, not counting the €1.2 billion order for French warships, isn't it about time that these were targeted for EU sanctions?
I think my right honourable friend is absolutely right on this issue. We have set out a clear set of sanctions in terms of Russia's behaviour towards Ukraine. We've taken a series of steps so far in terms of putting asset freezes and travel bans on named individuals. We've taken a series of diplomatic and other steps, and we've set out the so-called Stage 3 sanctions that we think should be taken if further incursions and further destabilisation of south and eastern Ukraine are set out. And we do believe that restrictions on arms sales should certainly be part of that.
Catherine McKinnell.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister promised by the end of this Parliament a third of his cabinet would be women. We know that the former Culture Secretary had to go, but we now have only 3 out of 22 of his departments run by women. Does he agree with the new Culture Secretary that this is because government appointments should always be made on merit?
What I said was that I wanted to see a third of my front bench ministers being women at the end of a Conservative government. We have made some important progress in terms of the numbers of people on the front bench. I have to say, with respect to my coalition partner, that in terms of cabinet numbers, the Liberal Democrats need to do a bit more to pull their weight on this issue. But I hope to be making further progress.
Sir Peter Tapsell.
Reverting to the subject of Royal Mail, as the leader of the stockbroking firm which brought British Gas to the market, and as the author of the phrase "Ask Sid," may I tell the Prime Minister that the questions of criticisms of the way that the Royal Mail launch is handled by its party opposite shows their total ignorance of city markets. The fact is that when you are trying to make an immense sale, you have to take infinite trouble to find people who are to underwrite it. And they are not able to prophesy what stock markets are going to be like a week ahead. And therefore, the whole way, prudent way in which this was handled was very sensible. Because if you do stop waving, you're waving goodbye.
Order! Order! People shouldn't gesticulate at the right honourable gentleman. I know he's nearing his conclusion.
If your issue fails, those institutions responsible for its launch are ruined.
We're deeply grateful. The Prime Minister!
The Father of the House makes an important point, which is when you are privatising state-owned industries, if you sell them for less than the price set out, it is written off as a failure, and if you sell it for anything more than the price, you're accused of undervaluing the business. That has always been the way, and as I said, that is what Labour said with respect to British Airways, British Telecom, British Aerospace. They opposed every single move to build a strong, competitive private industrial sector in our country, and that continues today.
Siobhan McDonough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. L from Mitcham would like to be a policeman, but he's only working part-time and can't afford the £1,000 bobby tax he needs to pay to apply to join the Met. His mum and dad are foster carers, and they would like to give it to him if they had it. May I ask the Prime Minister if my constituent is capable of passing the academic, fitness and testing requirements of the police, Why should his bank balance stop him? When did becoming a Metropolitan Police officer become an aspiration for the few rather than the many?
The Honourable Lady has asked questions about what she calls the Bobby tax, and let me make 3 points to her. First, it is not a tax. Secondly, it is not a barrier to recruitment. And thirdly, recruitment is taking place in the Metropolitan Police. That is what's happening. We're seeing people being recruited. And as is happening, members of who want to join the Metropolitan Police are able to get assistance with this qualification that they now require.
Nadeem Zahawi.
Mr. Speaker, last week we marked the Bard's nativity. 400 years and 50 ere the Swan of Avon breathed his first. Stratfordians on Saturday processed through their town bearing rosemary in memory of their immortal son. And here in your apartments, last night young Stratford scholars staged a scene from Shakespeare's works, amazed a noble multitude with their art. Mr. Speaker, could this right honourable man, the captain of our state, lend his help to make our national poet's birth a national day? And could he too disclose before the House what Shakespeare means to him?
Can I thank my honourable friend for that beautifully and brilliantly crafted question about the anniversary of Shakespeare's birth. It is a moment for celebration, not just here in Britain, but all across the world, where Shakespeare's works are getting a wider and wider understanding and distribution. I won't attempt the quotes that he has brought out in his question, but I would say to any politician, if you read Henry V's speech before Agincourt, if that doesn't inspire and drive you on, I can't think what does.
Alex Cunningham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When will he publish the regulations to introduce standard packaging for tobacco products and ban smoking in cars with children present?
Well, I can't prejudge the Queen's speech, but we've said that we want to take action on this front, and we will.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Textile, engineering, food and drink manufacturing are all booming in Huddersfield and Connemara. For example, Chimera Fabrics from Meltham are producing the upholstery for Boris's Routemaster buses, which have been very, very busy this week, but they are creating jobs and apprenticeships. Will the Prime Minister praise them and all the other local firms that have agreed to attend my first ever jobs fair in Home Firth on Friday, the 20th of June?
Well, first of all, let me pay tribute to my honourable friend for holding these job fairs. A number of members of Parliament have taken this approach and have seen real benefits in local areas as you get businesses coming forward, pledging apprenticeships, pledging to take people on, and you can bring them together with people who are looking for work. What we've seen since the recess is a series of figures in our economy, growth now running at over 3%, 1.5 million of our fellow countrymen and women in work since this government came to power, inflation now at a 5-year low, business confidence at its highest level since the early 1970s. There's still a lot more work to do. There's absolutely no complacency. The long-term economic plan is not completed, but it is well on its way.
Mark Lazarevic.
Before he was elected, the Prime Minister said that if they let me, he would put a wind turbine on 10 Downing Street, making use of the cheapest, most developed form of renewable energy. Last week, he announced that his party wants to end support for onshore wind, even though the government's own survey this week showed that 70% of the public now support it. What changed his mind?
He called them bird.
What has changed is we've seen a massive increase of onshore wind in our country. We will achieve, with what is in the planning system and under construction, approaching 10% of our electricity demand provided by onshore wind. So I think the question then is it right to continue to overrule local planners and local people, and does it continue to be right to put taxpayers' money in after you've built out that onshore wind? I don't believe it is, and the Conservative Manifesto will make that very clear for local communities to see. Other parties will have to make their own choices.
Stephen Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last few weeks in Eastbourne, over £160 million of private investment has been announced. We've had 3,000 new apprentices since the general election, and unemployment is almost 20% down compared to this time last year. In short, in Eastbourne, we're coming through tremendously successfully from the difficult economic downturn. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that where Eastbourne goes, the UK follows?
Well, I'm glad to hear that Eastbourne is leading the way, particularly on apprentices. Where we are is we've got 1.6 million apprentices have started under this government. Our target is for 2 million. We want to see a particular expansion of the higher level apprenticeship schemes, but it's a major part of delivering our long-term economic plan.
Mrs. Sharon Hodgson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Prime Minister has read last week's excellent report by the All-Party Group on ticket abuse, which set out how consumers are getting a raw deal from the secondary market. Now, the question is, Mr. Speaker, whose side is the Prime Minister on? His new Culture Secretary, who praised ticket touts as classic entrepreneurs, or the millions of ordinary fans who are sick and tired of being ripped off?
Well, I haven't seen the report that the Honourable Lady mentions. I will have a look at it and I will discuss it with my right honourable friend, who I welcome to the Cabinet, who I think... I noticed Labour seemed to criticise his appointment. I'm not quite sure on what basis they were doing that. I think he'll do an excellent job for our country. I'm very happy to study that report that she mentions.
Charlotte Leslie.
Mr. Speaker, the number of unemployed job seekers in Bristol has fallen by 25%. Bristol North West has fallen by 25% in the last year, but there's obviously still much more to do. I'm also hosting a jobs fair this Friday. To try and drive even lower. In the light of the Chancellor's welcome commitment to full employment, what else is the government doing to make this ambitious aspiration a reality?
Well, what we've seen already is 1.7 million private sector new jobs created, far outstripping the loss of public sector jobs, so there are 1.5 million people in work altogether. We've seen an increase in full-time work, which I think is very welcome because people often want to work more hours than they're currently able to. In terms of driving further employment growth, I think the clear message to businesses is you've got the £2,000 off your national insurance bill, which I think can help people to take on new employees. There's the cut to business rates for many shops in our high street, which I think is also very welcome. And from next year, anyone under the age of 21, you won't have to pay any national insurance contributions in respect of them at all. We want to see more people in work and to raise even further that level of aspiration in our country.
Henrik.
Mr. Speaker, nuclear power is a very important component of the UK's energy mix because it produces large amounts of electricity with very little CO2. This government calls itself the greenest government ever, but has ceded control of our nuclear energy policy to foreign companies. What will his government do to ensure that nuclear power stations, such as Hinkley Point C, which is already 5 years behind schedule, are brought online on time?
Well, I have to say to the honourable gentleman, I'm sure he has a constituency interest in this because the North West has very important energy assets for our country. The last Labour government was in power for 13 years. It never built a nuclear power station nor made any progress on moving towards doing it. Under this government, we've got Hinkley Point going ahead. We've got exciting developments at Wilver in Anglesey. I believe there is the opportunity of more to come. That is what we're doing, putting our money where our mouth is and making sure we have nuclear power providing high-quality baseload power which is carbon-free.
Stuart Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Peterborough effect is back. Business confidence is returning, unemployment is falling, and more new jobs are coming to my constituency. Much of that new prosperity relies on infrastructure spending financed by private pension funds. Does my right honourable friend share my regret that Labour's raid on company retirement funds, the brainchild of the shadow chancellor, and estimated to have amounted to £118 billion last week by the OBR, not only wrecked private pensions, but hobbled vital private sector infrastructure investment in our country for a generation?
Well, I'm delighted to hear about the Peterborough effect, that you've got employment rising, unemployment falling, more people taking on apprenticeships and businesses expanding. That is what we see across our country, and it's fascinating that 29 minutes into Prime Minister's questions, not a single Labour Member of Parliament has mentioned GDP or unemployment, growth in our country or our economic plan. They don't want to talk about our economy because they can see it's getting better under this government.
Will the Prime Minister make representations in relation to the cases of Princesses Sahar and Jawahar, who have been held under house arrest in Saudi Arabia for more than 10 years and have been refused access to food for more than 40 days as a result of speaking to the Western media? And would you agree with me that human rights and women's rights should be our priorities in our relationship with Saudi Arabia?
I read the report, as the Honourable Lady did, and I share her concern about it, and I'll certainly look into it further. In terms of our relations with all countries, we do give a proper priority to human rights and to the rule of law, and we raise these issues with all countries that we meet with.
Could
could I gently tell the Prime Minister that Liberal Democrat women not only pull their weight, but are perfectly ready and willing to punch above their weight? I recently hosted the premiere of The Honour Diaries, a hard-hitting film about the honour culture and what can be done to girls and women in its name. I know that issues of FGM and forced and early marriage are hugely important to my right honourable friend. So would he please consider viewing the film and showing it at the Girls' Summit on these issues that he is hosting in July?
I think the Honourable Lady, first of all, can I thank her for the work that she does, particularly on women in enterprise with the Business Department, I think is vitally important. The point I was making is merely that I know all parties in this House want to see greater gender equality in terms of representation, presence in government and the rest of it, and all parties have made progress. My party has made progress, but there is more that we want to do. Specifically on her concerns about FGM, about preventing sexual violence in conflict, we're taking huge steps this year in raising the profile of those issues. I pay tribute to the leadership shown by the Foreign Secretary. Also, as a country that's met its targets in terms of 0.7% of aid going in GDP going in aid, we're able, I think, to push this item right up the agenda, which we'll do over the course of this year.
Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, Ukrainians in Scotland wrote to Alex Salmond expressing disgust and astonishment at the First Minister's statement that he admired President Putin. Will the Prime Minister support the statements of the Scottish Ukrainian community and Labour in condemning those statements which support a regime which oppresses its own minority groups and silences its critics?
Well, I agree wholeheartedly with the Honourable Lady. I think that what Alex Salmond said was a major error of judgment. I think all of us in this House should be supporting the Ukrainian desire to be a sovereign, independent country and to have the respect of the international community and party leaders for that ambition.
Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning I met with Joe's Jumpstart, who are a charity campaigning for defibrillators in schools, and it's excellent news the government is making progress on this. Will my right honourable friend congratulate North Lincolnshire Council, who have worked with myself and my honourable friend for Cleethorpes, and are this year committing £75,000 to a programme of up to 50 community public access defibrillators that will save lives.
Well, this sounds like an excellent campaign. We have, as a country, taken a lot of steps forward in terms of making sure this sort of equipment is more readily available, because if you can find people who suffered a heart attack quickly, you can save lives in those golden minutes, in that golden hour when it first strikes. I think it sounds like an excellent idea, and I join him in paying tribute to North Lincolnshire Council.
George House.
Over the last 12 months, the use of food banks in Knowsley has increased by 93%. And social landlords report that rent arrears have gone up by 8.4%. Will the Prime Minister accept that the government's own policies are driving up debt and poverty in places like Knowsley?
What I would say to the honourable gentleman is clearly the best route out of poverty is work, and we should welcome the fact there are 1.5 million more people in work. If we look at the figures, of course, yes, he's right that food bank usage has gone up, not least because food banks are now properly advertised and promoted, not least by Job Centre Plus, but also by local authorities. But if he wants to deal in facts, the OECD has shown that the proportion of people struggling to buy food in the UK has actually fallen since before Labour's Great Recession. And I know that members opposite want to make this argument about poverty and inequality in Britain, but the fact is the statistics don't back them up. Inequality has fallen compared with when they were in office. There are fewer people in relative poverty and fewer children in relative poverty. The picture they want to paint, because they can't paint a picture about an economy that isn't growing, they can't paint a picture about people not getting jobs, but the picture they're trying to paint is wholly false.
Newmark.
With the service sector, with the manufacturing sector, and with the construction and manufacturing sector all growing at 3% plus, would the Prime Minister agree with me that the economy is well on the road to recovery and rebalancing as well?
No, well, I'm grateful for my honourable friend's question. The recent figures did show that manufacturing was one of the faster growing sectors of our economy, and I welcome that. But I think what the Chancellor said so powerfully in his budget is that we're not resting on our laurels or saying the job is done. There's more work to address the fundamental long-term weaknesses of the British economy. We need to manufacture more, we need to export more, we need to save more, and we need to invest more. And unlike the party opposite, we've got policies that promote all of those things.
Loud injury time because there's been so much noise. Not on this occasion from her seat, but on her feet. Fiona McTaggart.
Mr. Speaker. Has the Prime Minister seen the survey which shows that 2/3 of local councils are either dimming or cutting their streetlights at night? And does he think that women are feeling safe in their local communities at night under his government?
Well, I have, like all honourable members who take part in election campaigns, had been lobbied on this issue on both sides of the argument. I think it is an issue for local determination. I want to see good street lighting, but we should also listen to the arguments from the police and others about the effect that this has.
Speaker, I congratulate my right honourable friend and the Chancellor on our long-term economic prosperity that's come forward. In areas like St Albans, barely a house is under £250,000. Can I make a plea through him that we look at the stamp duty thresholds around that limit to help young people get on the housing ladder?
Well, I'm very happy to look at the issues that she raises, but the weapon that we have used to try and help young people who don't have rich parents but who can afford mortgage payments is Help to Buy, because it helps them to get together that deposit, a 5% deposit rather than a 15 or a 20% deposit. The Labour Party are shouting about this. They should be welcoming this scheme. It is expanding aspiration and growth in our country. That is what they should be promoting, and that is the approach we'll take.
Order.